So as was mentioned in 71, I moved from New York City to take a position at the medical school in Quebec City. And in 1992, when I retired, and we moved to Toronto. And of course, in Toronto, I was very much interested in the industrial areas. My interest has been always in industrial switching as far as the layout goes. Excuse me, I'm getting a message.
You don't see your mouse. Lower your here.
Oh, okay.
Just a tiny bit. Okay.
Okay, excuse me, my wife is adjusting the screen for me. Thank you. Okay, so to reiterate, so as was mentioned, this was when I looked at the areas, this was the origin of the CN Weston sub. So in this presentation, I will first show some images that I've taken of the prototype industries and talk a bit about the rail activity and the trains that were run in the late 1980s. And a brief bit about the layout, some particularities of building a layout in a condo. The second version was built in a condo. Then we'll have a look at the rail served industries and the modeled work. And finally, how we operate. And we're using computer generated switch lists. This one is not JMRI, it's ShipIt. So this is showing the map of the Great Lakes district of CN, of Canadian National. And the area that I'm modeling is the Weston sub, which is this small area. I'll just zoom in for a minute. The Macmillan Yard, which at one point was the largest classification yard in Canada, is now second to the Symington Yard in Winnipeg. There is a section of the Halton sub and the Weston sub here, and I'm modeling the 12 miles of this section, which is where the industries are located. A brief bit about the history of the Weston sub and its origins. The Toronto and Guelph Railway built a railway in Toronto and extending to Sarnia in 1851. And in time, that was taken over by the Grand Trunk Railway. And in 1923, I believe because of financial reasons, the Grand Trunk Railway was taken over by CN. And the Weston sub has its origins in 1965, when what was previously called the Brampton Subdivision was divided into a 17-mile stretch from downtown Toronto to the Halton sub as the Weston sub. The remaining part was a Halton subdivision and a section, the Guelph subdivision, heading west to Sarnia, near the Detroit border. In 2009, GO Transit, which is the local Ontario commuter line, purchased the Weston sub, but CN retained traction rights for the use of freight. Now, the only freight that is running on this area is from the Macmillan Yard to the industrial area that I pointed out on the Weston sub. There's no through freight traffic on the Weston sub. And in fact, when I looked at the maps, the street maps of Toronto, I realized that the Freelance track that I had designed just a reasonable Freelance industrial switching layout, which was an out and back layout. That is, trains would leave the classification yard, go to the industries, and return. I realized the Weston sub itself was identical in its structure. That is, trains left a section of the Macmillan Yard. They had a 33-track section that was designated for the industrial area on the Weston sub. So trains would leave the Macmillan Yard, go only to service the Weston sub and industries in that area, and interchange with CP at the Lambden Yard. The Lambden Yard being almost the home of Bernard Helen, who spoke earlier today. And in addition to the one freight train that runs now, actually, we'll get back. The one freight train that runs now on the Western sub, there are a number of passenger units that run. There's the GO train, the commuter line. Via train runs from Toronto Union Station on the Western sub. And there is a recently built express line from Union Station to Pearson International Airport, the UP Express. So the original Western sub was a single track. It's now 4-track to accommodate the passenger traffic. So this is a map of the area, and we have here the Western sub. This is the Halton sub, which continues west, and the junction at Hall West goes on to the Western sub. The industries of interest that I'm modeling are in this 12-mile section. There are other industries along the Western sub, and we have 3 yards involved: the Macmillan Yard, a storage yard at Malport, and the Lambden Yard, which is the CP yard, which is used mostly for storage now, but there is interchange with the CN. This section is about 12 miles or 19 kilometers, and this is about the same. I've outlined the area that is modeled. On the first version of the CN Weston sub, which began in 1999, we modeled the section from Hall West down to the interchange with the CB yard. With the expansion in 2015, when we moved to condominium, we had a bit more room, so we've now extended this to include the halted sub. I should point out that downtown Toronto is in this area, and so I live about 20 minutes from the Western sub. So it's very accessible, and it's a good source of prototype images. So that converted me from freelance to modeling a prototype. This is a detail from the latest trackside guide, the 2022 trackside guide, and it's showing the section of interest, which I've outlined in red. The industries are along this area, and I'm particularly concentrating on mileposts from about 5 up to about 12, with the industries in this area, Rexdale and Etobicoke North. Control of the Western sub is under control of CTC, which was in Macmillan Yard, the control. The control is now in Montreal. However, the industries are served from service tracks, and the service tracks and the industries are operated under yard limits. This is a map of produced by the GO train commuter line, and it's actually a map that is used in a simulator to train GO train operators. However, it shows very well the north and south service tracks and the industries that branch off from them. And you can see this is a 1999 map, and that there are several industries which are still being actively served by rail. And from the time I began taking photos, about 1998, until about 2002, as I would go back to photograph, I would see that more and more of these branches were being paved over, and the industries were being served by truck. But there is still a good amount of activity presently, even although there's only one freight now that runs. It runs at in the evening. It starts out at 9:45. But in the 1980s, the era I'm modeling, there were several freights per week. As we proceed further east, which is to the right here towards Toronto, we have Etobicoke North, again, industries served from the North Service Track and the South. We've modeled a number of these industries and on specific streets. We've modeled also a number of the major roads that cross over or under the Weston Sub. And there is a model also of the Humber River, which runs in this direction. What we are modeling, however, we modeled one track which combines the north and south service tracks. So there is a fair amount of freelance to this. And again, heading towards Union Station, we have here a major paper producing industry, Facel, and it's changed hands in the time I've been in Toronto. We are modeling this on the layout. It's on the west end of the Weston Sub. However, on the prototype, it's in the east end. So there has been some change in direction. And this is part of a map that I looked at, which is what made me realize that there was a good fit for a prototype. And this is what changed me from doing freelance, where I had no notion of operations or a prototype, into trying to follow closely a prototype. As we can see here in the city, these are, you'll recognize on the layout, Martin Grove Road, for example, and Bethridge Road. And this is the area where I've photographed the industries, the 7 industries that existed here, that we replicated. Another aspect of traffic in the city, industrial modeling, is that we have a number of street crossings. For example, Bethridge Road is crossed throughout these industrial spurs. These spurs have to be guarded either by the crew or under certain conditions, as we'll see from employee timetables, by police that have to be called to stop traffic. And also, there are some restrictions, such as operating during rush hour is not permitted. On this west end of the layout of the prototype, on Disco Road, there is a bulk transfer facility, which is one of the oldest rail-served industries on the Weston Sub. Again, this is modeled on the east end, whereas it's actually on the west end of the Weston Sub. There are other industries along here, but we've picked on modeling here in Rexdale and here and in Etobicoke North. So once I decided that I would model a prototype, I arranged with the Toronto Research Library to do a study of the industries in the 1980s. And they provided me with a lot of useful material. These 3 books of many pages, which are industrial directories and lists all of the industries in the area, their street address, number of employees, the type of work they do, what they produce. And this gives a good idea of what would be a rail served industry, and was very useful documentation. This is an example of a 1983 employee timetable. And as we can see, for example, on Dixon Road, one of the areas we modeled, control of the crossings, track crossings, have to be done by the police. In other areas, it's done by the crew. One result is that on this Weston sub, in the 1980s, cabooses were still used. I know CN used cabooses until 1986 because of the number of streets that have to be flagged and protected. And we'll see a General Mills, which one of the industries we have modeled in this area. For example, there's a restriction for engines not permitted in the building. Another thing one sees on these timetables is that in certain areas, 6-axle locomotives were not permitted. So as a result, we use our SD40s for transfer runs rather than for way freights that would go to the industries. And we use 4-axle locomotives for the way freights. So we'll have a look at the prototype. This, for example, was taken from a distance. And this is the paper manufacturing plant, which uses recycled paper. It's now Facel. And this is a typical view of industries that are being served by rail. Visits to this area are useful. It gives a good idea of the color of the foliage in the summer, the colors of the sidewalks, and the general appearance of the area. Again, a warehouse which is served by rail. The streets in the area have no lane divisions. They are 22 feet wide. And again, we've used these photos as a good guide for the color and appearance, the general appearance. For example, I have watched Procar trains, cars being taken across these tracks to a meatpacking plant that is in the background here, St. Helens Meatpacking. We'll see that on the prototype and on the layout. But this is typical of the streets and the industrial area near Toronto. Here is one of the two sidings or stubs, industrial stubs, that are serving the paper plant. This is a view of the facade. And this is St. Helens meatpacking plant, which is no longer there. It's now, the condos have been built there. This general area was involved very much a number of meatpacking plants and slaughterhouses. So I have watched Procars being taken across the street, and you'll notice these tank cars, which we have reproduced in our model. So this is a model that is typical of the area. Reasonably new steel buildings. This building, in fact, was a glass manufacturing plant, or is. I took photos of it, and I've used it for a different plant on the layout, which is a metal processing plant. There are several of these medium-sized industries in the area, metal fabricators and others, which are still being served by rail. And finally, this is one of the 5 or 6 cement plants that are around Toronto. This one is on Bethridge Road, which we have modeled on the layout as Lafarge cement. I must take note of the people who have built the layout. I could not have built this by myself. The first version was especially Bill O'Shea, who was especially helpful. He was our electronics guru, and I learned quite a bit from him about electronics. He developed a unique signaling system, block signaling that we had on the layout, based on control by magnets. And Keith Martell, who was a fellow member of CARM, Canadian Association of Railway Modelers, Steve Messner, and Reverend Keane. We would meet every Wednesday, as we still do, and we would meet every Wednesday and work on the layout and operate. In 2015, we moved from our townhouse, which had many steps. I was having knee problems, and we moved into a condo, a 2-bedroom and den condo in Toronto, downtown Toronto, on the 31st floor. And my wife and I looked at the condo, and we had thought of building a layout in one of the bedrooms, but we decided that that would not work, not only because of the space or the mess of building a layout, but also because every Wednesday we would have 4 or 5 people coming in to spend the day. So my wife suggested why not buy another condo? So I did that. I bought a small condo in the same building on the 16th floor. It required transferring by 2 elevators. But I had the same help: Bill O'Shea, Keith Martell, James Razor, who joined us later, and he was young for us, a young architect, and he's done some exquisite, fine work on some buildings, which you will see. And 2 new members, Mark Early and Terry Denleko. So this is the condo. It was a studio. One enters here. We have a kitchen, which was useful for our lunches. And I've outlined the layout in color here. And so we had nice wide aisles, 4 to 5 feet on each side, and room for a crew lounge room. And the layout was roughly 25 by 14. Sorry about that. Just go back 1. Okay, so this is showing the construction of the layout. There are a few peculiarities in the building a layout in a condo. One could not use power tools. There are certain noise restrictions. So when we were building the layout, I had arranged for a construction permit, a renovation permit, during which I removed a partition and did some other renovations. And at the same time, we profited from being able to make some noise on weekdays from 9 to 5. Especially, for example, with this system that I'm using to support the layout. This is a Rubbermaid system with steel brackets and steel supports. But to fasten to the wall, these walls are concrete block. So I had to use jack drill to drill. And it was a bit unnerving when I thought of the neighbor next door, but it was a renovation period, so it seemed to go all right. You may notice a faint pencil line across the top, and that line was drawn using a laser instrument centered in the room and rotated. This allowed us to have very level, to be sure of the level all around the room of the layout. The layout is basically shelved around the wall with a central peninsula. The structure is built from a box structure using plywood, 5-inch thick plywood sections for the surrounding area, and dimensional lumber as cross pieces, and that will support the 2-inch foam, which will support the tracks. This leaves everything open with no legs underneath, allowing for shelving space and workbenches. This is showing the structure of the peninsula, which is basically the same structure. The plywood frame and dimensional lumber across. You can see here the 2x8 sections of 2-inch styrofoam, which will go as a surface, will be applied as a surface with no more nails as an adhesive to the top. This shows a bit of the structure of the brackets from Rubbermaid. These you can get in different lengths depending on the depth of the track. Then a piece of wood was screwed to the bracket, and then using an angle bracket, this is screwed to the layout itself. One other particularity is because this is a condo, there are restrictions in appearance of from the window. So we had to span 14 feet for the track. So we obtained two 14-foot steel angle bars, bolted together, made a good strong box structure. And on that, we built the wood surface for the layout. And using 1x1 for the legs, adjustable legs, these were aligned with the frame of the window. So it was less obtrusive in the window, although we are on the 16th floor here. Some details of the layout, we arranged that the depth would be no more than 24 inches for a good stretch, so it was easy to get to the rear of the layout. The peninsula is 44 inches wide, but we're operating industries from both sides. The track is code 55 Atlas Flex track. We have 3 scale miles from Macmillan to the industry is 3 scale miles. Turnouts were microengineering. We had a lot of problems with those. I purchased over 50 microengineering turnouts, installed them, installed their servos to operate them, installed the wiring for the frog. And when we started running trains, we had a lot of derailments. And I measured the turnouts, and it turns out that most of them were out of gauge. I reported it to microengineering. They found that their mold, being 25 years old, had worn to the point that their stock rails were coming out too thick. So we started grinding. They offered to replace them, but it was easier, we felt, to adjust them. So we were grinding the rails down to gauge, and I still am occasionally doing that. But in general, I've been replacing them with Atlas code 55 number 7s. On the layout, we have generous curvature. The shortest curvature is 14 inches, and that in N scale is still a moderate curve. The rolling stock, all cars have been installed body-mounted couplers, replaced the truck-mounted, replaced the plastic wheels with metal, and all cars are weighed to 40 grams per car, which is considerably more than the NMRA standards. But in N scale, the heavier car tracks better. You have less derailments. Control is by lens, DCC, and about half of our locomotives are sound equipped. This shows a turnout with the servo attached. This is a 9-gram servo, the type used in model airplanes that operate. And the system is developed by Barrett Hill. And in this system, you can program the servo You can program the rate of movement and its direction. And they use a system of touch toggles, which these touch toggles depend on the capacitance of your finger. So you just brush your finger on them and it will change the position of the servo. And you'll get a change from your green to your red. This is part of a panel for the classification yard. The layout is divided into 3 power districts with PSX circuit breakers. The locomotives, our locomotive roster is in tune with the age, with the 1986 remodeling. We have SD40s, the 6-axle units, GP40s, and GP9 remodels, which are all 4-axle locomotives. This is just a view when you enter the layout. To the left is the storage yard, Malport yard. In the distance is the Malport classification yard. And the Rexdale and Etobicoke North industries are on the peninsula and on the wall in the back. And that's Keith Martell calmly looking out the window instead of working. So let's have a look at the models. And this is the work of James Razor, the architect. He took trips on the Weston Sub with the purpose of photographing the environment there. For example, he photographed the fence and replicated buildings. And this is N scale. So if you get an idea of how tall a person is from the door here, for example, and I'm sure that Bernard Helen would appreciate the detail here. And notice there are clothes hanging on the clothesline. And you'll see throughout the layout this work of James. So again, just to refresh your memory, this is a map, the map that we're of the area we're modeling, starting with the Macmillan yard, the section, the 33-track section, the Halton sub, the Malport yard, and the industrial area of Rexdale and Etobicoke North, and the Landon yard. All 3 of these yards are integral to the layout and the operation that we're doing. So here's the track plan. The Macmillan yard, we have a 9-track yard here, which can accommodate over 100 cars. There's an engine service activity area here, fueling and repair in place and so on. We have a arrival yard, a departure yard, and a runaround for the locomotives to get to the front of trains being made up, and a nice long lead for switching lead. Now, the system that we are using to operate is called Shivit, works in this fashion that the movement of a car is generated when an industry requests a car. Either it requests an empty for a product, or it will request a product that it needs. And all of the cars that are on the layout stay on the layout. No cars move, leave the layout, or come on. What happens is that products that are taken to Landon yard, for example, from the industry, are taken to a virtual layout that you develop in the software. And this virtual layout is requesting the product from the industry. So a box car, for example, full of paper from the paper manufacturing plant, after 24 hours will become an empty. And that empty is available for other industries or to be filled with a product from the virtual industry and then taken to the, not to the industry, it's taken to the classification yard. So we have a transfer run that runs only from the classification yard to the Landon yard and back, bringing goods for the industries and to the industries. The Waithe rates are made up in the classification yard and then set out to the industries. We have here, this was a warehouse which has since been removed. There's a scrap yard, and then the Waithe rates cross along the bridge to the industries, first to Rexdale West, then Rexdale East, and then to the industries on the peninsula. We have these 9 industries. Out of the 9, 7 are duplicated from the prototype. The warehouse is not on the prototype, but there are many warehouses in the area. We didn't pick a specific one. So let's have a look at the model. This is the Macmillan Yard. Here's our arrival track, a departure track, and locomotive run track, and the 9 tracks for classification. The background flats, again, were done by James. And we have 1 track in the back dedicated to maintenance of Waithe. And in the background, there is the engine service area and a repair and place track and administration. From there, we go to past the warehouse, which I didn't include because it's been removed. We go to the warehouse, to the scrapyard, I'm sorry. The scrapyard, Aurora Metals, again, the background was done by James Razor based on his photographs from the Weston Sub. So the warehouse is over here. And this is the storage yard. It's can hold about 90 cars. And this is where either empties or products are stored until the industry is ready for the material that has come from the virtual industries. Underneath the buildings here is the hidden 14-inch radius track. This is the paper manufacturing plant, these 3 buildings. Again, they use recycled paper and produce various types of paper products. And again, the background as part of the Weston Sub. From there, we go to a petrochemical plant. Now, there is no petrochemical plant on the Weston Sub. This is Freelance. It's just nice to have. I'm very familiar with chemicals. From there, this is the metal manufacturing plant, these 2 buildings. And this is the building that I used from photographs of the glass manufacturing plant. On the peninsula, the first industry is the meatpacking plant based on St. Helens. In the background is an administration building and testing laboratories. And the tanks, as you see from the prototype, we've remodeled the tanks here. And this building was scratch built by Bill O'Shea from photographs of the actual building, including the cooling towers which were built. This building houses the freezer and refrigeration section where fresh meat is handled. The building in this corner we have a track for tank car clean out and for covered hoppers on this track. And this building uses crude oil, fuel oil, and produces steam, which is necessary for the meatpacking plant. And next to that is what was modeled after Lipton's on Belfield Road on the Weston Sub. Lipton's was a subsidiary of General Mills, and again, these three buildings were modeled after the existing Liptons. I am now incorporating this building as a part of the meatpacking plant. Then we go around the corner to Bethridge Road. This is the part of the cement plant. This is a plant that uses cement as a food stock, and along with wood chips and other aggregate, produces different cement products, including cement lined pipes, for example, and cement siding, which uses wood chips. This has since been enlarged. There's more on this side over here. And finally, this is the transload facility, Northwest Freight and Bulk Transfer Facility, which is still active, being rail served, and is much larger than is modeled here. And again, there is a truck weigh scale here, modeled by James. And here's the landing yard, and this is where goods leave and get onto the layout. As I said, no rolling stock leaves the layout. We have about over 100 cars that recirculate here as needed by the software program. So onto operations. This is a photo from 2014 in the first layout. To the left is part of a description that I send the operating instructions to new operators before they arrive. Also a sample switch list and a track plan, so that when they arrive, they get their switch lists and they have a daily order bulletin if there are any major changes for their particular way freight. The system that I use and have been using for over 20 years is, I find it an amazing system, and it's very realistic. The program is built by Albion Software. It's not free software, but you get what you pay for in a sense. In a system, you create a database, and in the database, you select the types of cars you need for your industries. You have to research your industries carefully so that you know exactly what products they need, what products they produce, and your car tax will be based on that. And what you will ship and what will be the consignments that are needed. How many empties you need, how long it takes to empty a car, for example, what frequency do you want for a particular product, and also the amount of track space you have to accommodate cars is part of the determinant of the activity. So with this database, you can determine the amount of activity you want for any product and for any industry. Now, creating a database is not difficult. You make up what you want, but then you submit it to the software. The scheduler will go through a series of iterations, and it will give you a score. Now, the idea of using the program itself is to get a balance between what you're producing and what you need for each product. And this, if you have even, for example, 2 industries, and they each have several products, it would be difficult to arrange by yourself a good balance so that things stay in balance. Now, what happens is there's an ancillary program created by Jean Piquet in Montreal. It's called the Balancer. And what the Balancer does is that it takes the results from the program itself, the ShipIt program, and it will tell you what is wrong with your database, what you need to do to correct it. So when you first enter your database, based on what you think is reasonable, you may get a score from the program of 30, for example. And the aim is to get this score less than 1. Once you get it less than 1, the system will run for years. You can generate session after session. Things will run well. There will be nothing will be out of balance. Nothing will come to a halt. The balancer will tell you what is wrong. For example, you do one iteration, the balancer will say, for example, that for a particular industry, you're producing too much paper for the virtual industry that is accepting it. And the balancer will tell you what to do to correct it. And you will soon get your balance down to less than 1. And you're set. You're set for life unless you change, for example, a different industry, and then you go back and go through the system. But what is great about this program is not only the satisfaction of building something, creating something, but it's that you have realistic movement of products that is not random. It is based on what you've determined that an industry needs. So for this, of course, you're interested in the particular car and its car number. But it's a lot of fun. This is a screenshot, for example, of first you set up your products in the database. For example, all of the products that you'll be using, a meat extract package which goes into boxcars for the meatpacking plant, paper that is produced. I use a large P to distinguish between a product that is coming from the industry and a consignment. For example, scrap paper versus the paper produced. Corn oil, for example, for the Lipton's food plant will travel in the glass-lined tank car. Next, for each industry, for example, the laminate yard, these are virtual industries. For each product, you have this entered in your database. For example, chemical dry bulk, which goes in a covered hopper. Chemical liquid bulk in a tank car. Plastic pellets will go into a covered hopper. So for each industry, you have a list of all of the products that are being produced. The scrapyard is producing recycled metal, for example. So these are the products. And for each industry, you have the consignment. For example, the laminate yard is needed to accept the clay and fiber, which is a byproduct of the paper manufacturing plant from the recycled paper. The laminate yard is receiving perishable food, which is, of course, in a reefer, coming from the meatpacking plant or the food processing plant. You also enter in your database the siding capacity. And you start with your actual siding capacity, but you don't have to stick with it. If you want to decrease the activity of an industry relative to another, for example, you simply say that you have less space for cars, so you decrease the capacity. If you want to increase activity at an industry, you increase the siding capacity. You may go up to the actual capacity, or even more if you have room to park cars elsewhere. So these are all part of the database that you enter. And when you're considering your trains, for example, on the layout, I've designed 2 Waithe rates to cover the 9 industries. Of course, when I'm running 12-car trains, there's no limit to the length of train I can run, but for appearance on this layout, 12 cars looks about right. But that means that you have to be able to have enough trains to satisfy the needs of the industries. So we divide it into 2. And what is useful is having the capacity. So I would balance total capacity between the 2 trains so that they're more or less equal. Now, the program also prints, of course, with the portion called the scheduler, the train line. So we'll see, for example, the Martin Grove train goes to the meatpacking plant and then heading back west on return to the cement plant and so on. The red train line is a transfer run, so that when products come back to the classification yard, they're picked up by the transfer run and taken to the landing yard. And then it will return with cars, either empties or loads, for the next train. This just shows the other train, which covers different industries. This is a sample switch list that the operator will get. And they will see, for example, with a road identification, a road number, and I've introduced a color code. This is a gray reefer, for example, containing meat. It's going from the Macmillan yard to the meat packing plant. Again, cement, the liquid chemical, going to the cement plant. So this is the switch list that would be used for the operator. And one thing is, because this is N scale and we have failing vision often, we've put larger numbers on tops of all of the cars. This also makes it easier to see in the yard where the cars are spaced a prototypical different distance from each other. So it's hard to see the numbers on the sides. And at each station where there's an industry, we have an indication of which track or which door number one should position a car. And this just shows a schematic showing how we can operate. So we're always operating the Waithe with the trailing edge. And I think I will just very quickly end this section. This is for the yard crew. The yard crew gets yard arrival lists, which is printed out by the system. And this allows you to know where the next destination of a train is going to be. So that when you're working in the yard, if you have cars for a meatpacking plant, they go into track number 6. So you're not randomly picking when you're making up the next train your cars. They're arranged in the classification yard. Well, thank you for attending, and thank you for inviting me.